Before I begin this video, I just want to say that the Callisto Protocol, although not what I expected, wasn't the worst game ever or anything like that. I did enjoy it, although I was really disappointed that the game was not a horror game, although it was marketed as a horror game. And I feel a lot of what could have been great horror was completely ruined by its attempt to be cinematic. And when it comes to being cinematic in a video game, the designers of the Callisto Protocol got everything wrong on a basic level. And instead of being a horror game that is also cinematic, what we get is an adventure action game with light horror elements. And I think there's a lot of deeper design issues in the Callisto Protocol than just that it has adventure game elements and design. But for this video, I'm just going to be talking about how its attempt at being cinematic, or wanting the player to have some sort of cinematic experience, goes completely against the game's sci-fi horror elements at almost every moment. And you know, it was marketed as a sci-fi horror game. I think most players wanted a sci-fi horror game, but what we got was an action adventure game. When a modern day AAA game that's like an action adventure game markets itself as cinematic, what they want you to believe is that the game will be like a highly immersive experience. It'll be a linear one that will keep the player on the edge of their seat in a smooth state of gameplay flow while offering high octane gameplay, badass set pieces, beautiful graphics, and a story that will keep you engaged from start to finish. You know, that's what a game that calls itself cinematic should offer. And by that definition, a cinematic experience should fit an action horror game pretty good. But that's just what they market themselves as, right? Instead, what modern AAA games, what these modern cinematic games offer is a linear game that follows the same old boring, sad, lazy formula. I'm going to start referring to this formula as the cinematic formula. If the game is marketed to be cinematic, I already know what the gameplay is going to be like. And that's not really the kind of game personally that I want to play or I have fun playing. They're usually kind of game where while the player may engage in combat every now and then, the combat is pretty shallow, usually consists of a lot of stealth segments and insta backstab kills or insta back of the headshot kills. And other than that simple kind of gameplay, there's not a whole lot else to do. There's a lot of walking and holding your forward key. You may be climbing or shimmying or crawling, but it's still just going to be the player holding their forward key, going in one straight path, because these games are story focused and they're about the story, but the gameplay between adventure action games is very formulaic. There's no variation, and it's kind of boring to play those games. And attempting to offer a cinematic experience in and of itself isn't what makes these games usually so cookie cutter and uninspired. It's the same cinematic formula they all follow in an attempt to seem cinematic to the player. But the issue here is that the cinematic formula, while it may somewhat work for these action adventure games that are focused on their story, It absolutely does not work in a horror game and actively goes against horror. That's not to say that horror cannot be cinematic, but this cinematic formula that adventure action games use cannot work for horror. But so when Glenn Schofield...
Hi, I'm Glenn Schofield, creator and director of Dead Space. I set out to make the scariest game of all time. Along the way, I had to break some rules, make some new ones, and really redefine how I make video games.
The co-creator of Dead Space said he was making a cinematic horror game. I personally had high hopes. I mean, I knew it was going to be the very first game from the studio, so I had realistic expectations. But with Glenn in charge, I was a bit hyped. I think Mr. Schofield genuinely understands horror on a deeper level than most people. And if you haven't seen the Ars Technica interviews with Glenn about the making of Dead Space, I highly, highly recommend it. And as one of the co-creators of Dead Space, I would say he also understands what it means to be truly cinematic. I would consider Dead Space 2 a very cinematic game. And, I figured he could do a modern-day cinematic action horror title right. Sadly, I was wrong, I guess. And the Callisto Protocol marketed itself not only as cinematic, but also, and mainly, as a sci-fi horror game. And to be honest, it did seem like a perfect recipe, yet it ended up being stuffed full of every lame ingredient that makes all the similar cookie-cutter cinematic adventure action games sour. It checked all the little boxes and followed the exact same formula that games like Tomb Raider does. All the while offering very little interesting moments throughout the game. And it does have some moments that shine, but those moments are few and far between. Striking Distance Studios wanted the Callisto Protocol to be immersive. And obviously the best way to scare a player in a horror game is to have them highly immersed in the game. And a cinematic game, if done right, can keep players not only immersed, but also on the edge of their seats. So the design choice to be linear and cinematic, I believe, was a sound one. So where did it all go wrong? See, AAA developers of adventure action games that follow the cinematic formula, they don't want their players to become the character. They want the player to watch a character. They don't want the player to think. They want you to watch things happen as you hold down your forward key. They don't want you to explore the world or have any sense of discovery. They want you to stick to the straight path that is laid out before you. They don't want you to become immersed in the world through gameplay. They want you to zone out and immerse in the same way you immerse yourself when you're watching a movie or a TV show. Which is what some people want to do, and that's fine. And I'm not saying there isn't a place for these types of games, but these AAA developers design around cinematic effect before designing around great gameplay. But if they had great gameplay first, then the cinematic effect would be much more powerful. So it's like they're creating pseudo-cinematic experiences and pseudo-gaming experiences. And this is the trap that the Callisto Protocol falls into. It feels like it was designed to be cinematic first and sci-fi horror last. But it should have been the other way around. The sci-fi horror and the action elements of the game should have created cinematic moments. The Callisto Protocol was marketed to be a linear sci-fi action horror game. If the game had been marketed from the start as an adventure action game, then that would make a lot of sense because it plays mostly like a shitty adventure action game. But it was marketed as a sci-fi horror game. They even released a 3-part mini-series called The Masters of Horror, about horror game design and how amazing the horror in the Callisto Protocol was going to be. Going back and watching this mini-series now that the game is released, it's It's almost comical, really. It's really kind of strange, because it's like a lot of the people they're interviewing, the developers, it's almost like they haven't played their own game. Like, so much of what they say that they expect the players to experience while playing the Callisto Protocol, the reverse of what they're saying is actually true.
It adds to the unknown.
It's about blowing air into the balloon, making it bigger and bigger. So when there's finally that moment of release, that burst of horror, the jump scare, we get as sort of big a reaction as possible from the player.
I want to feel getting spooked while looking over my shoulder. I want all of that. I love it all.
I think that's the beauty of the whole gaming world, is that you are truly immersed and you sort of control your own destiny. And
about horror, you know, it's not just sort of an endless series of jump scares one after another. With the Callisto Protocol, one of the things that we were aspired to do was to tell a simple story with complex characters. We wanted to have characters that changed, that grew, that went on an emotional journey, that you followed them along on. They came out the other side not quite what they were at the beginning.
That's what people are going to relate with, I think, the most. They're going to be more invested in the characters, and they're going to want to turn that scary corner and fight for what's right because they're invested in these characters.
whoa, wasn't that something?
And on the subject of a game being cinematic, just because a modern-day AAA adventure game calls itself cinematic, that doesn't mean it actually is. And that doesn't mean that there cannot be actual cinematic games. For example, I'd say Dead Space 2 is a great example of a real cinematic action horror game.
Good timing too. I'm getting close.
Okay, I got eyes in the tram station. I'll meet you there.
Not so fast. See that building, oxygen processing? There's a security station inside. You need to get there to lift the lockdown in the dome. Can't dock the tram until you do.
I have a feeling you weren't
Dead Space 2 is a perfect example of what a cinematic action horror game should be, really. I mean, it is intense, it is relentless, yet playing the game while challenging, it feels as smooth as butter. The gameplay flows so well, and the set pieces and the action are all so badass. It feels like you're watching it unfold in a cinema, but it's deeper than that. Like you have stepped out of yourself and are now not only the viewer, but also the character in the screen. It's like true immersion. And this is done not by some sad formula or template, but by truly good game design. The game is designed so that when the player is in a state of flow, they're rewarded for completing the gameplay challenges with new events that happen in the game. These new events, whatever they may be, offer new challenges and thus new gameplay. And it becomes a loop that feeds back on itself. The events that unfold are all gameplay related, and the story is tied in with the gameplay. This puts the player in that sense of pure immersion, and you add in the cinematic effects on top of that immersion, and the end result is the player having an immersive, cinematic experience. For example, watch this sequence from Dead Space 2. Before I play this clip, keep in mind to notice how smooth the transitions between each action segment are, as well as all the dynamic things happening in the environment. And as I, the player, move through the level or complete each challenge that the section of the level offers, the game continues to unfold before me, and this keeps myself and the game itself in a state of flow, and in a way rewards the player by keeping pace by introducing new segments and challenges. And soon the game and the player are synced together in a state of flow. And it is immersive, and this is what it should be like to play a cinematic game. So yeah, take a look.
happened? I thought we lost you.
Unscheduled stop. Where am I?
How did you end up there? Hang on. This won't be the most pleasant route, but it'll get you to the Cassini Towers residential sector. Damn it! Timon has your signal again.
What I expected from the Callisto Protocol, gameplay-wise, was something like the Dead Space 2 gameplay I just showed. Something where each new level and section presents new challenges and enemies, or revealed a new piece of story, or had some unique gameplay element, while keeping the horror and tension at maximum levels. But the Callisto Protocol, instead, is a linear adventure action game that feels closer to Tomb Raider than it does to Dead Space.